You don't want to sit. You've got 5 more minutes.
Dr. Crocker. How you doing? How are you, sir? I'm doing. Parker over there will get an eye. Yet one other person that should be up here instead of me. Good to see you. You know, Tim, we got our editors up here, Tim Sample.
You write your minutes.
Dr. Steve Crocker of ICANN. And this is my CEO, Mike Swetnam. This is Dr. Steve Crocker. Hi, it's a pleasure. Glad you could come. Steve, just hi, Steve. Ron Marks. There we go.
Gave us a lot of free advice at FCC. Domain name security extensions and a lot of stuff like that. Chair of ICANN.
Great America. So you hadn't sent the bill yet anyway. It may not be free for sure. Bill yet.
Why do you think I when we start?
Okay. Yeah, can I use? I don't know. Let me see. Let me see Ron's. This might be better yours.
What's that?
I'm looking for people's speeches and talking points. Will replace mine. No. You're not going to let me see yours?
You can see it, but if you could read those notes, I wish you the best of luck.
His are pretty good. I was hoping for better ones.
Enciphered his.
I deciphered mine and left-handed scroll on mine.
Did you see that thing on the carrier pigeon I sent you? Oh, I thought that was rich.
Is that where my talking points are?
That's right.
They
found a carrier pigeon from World War II at somebody's chip.
Oh yeah, they found. I saw that.
They can't delete it.
Well, it never
they can't decode it after they have the trace.
Probably.
So it wouldn't be the road block.
They would have the most effective skill. As long as you do it yourself. Mike, did you want a little summary? Is that what you want?
I was shopping for talking points. I was trying to find something better than his. He was going to use his, but
Total regulation taxation of the internet. That'll get their attention.
There you go.
I believe in state law. No,
I
I
was going to point of departure
I was going
anyway.
to ask to look at Jamie's, but I can't do the accent.
well,
Some days you'll be too technical.
You just end every word with
Oh,
You're doing a webcast, and it comes your time to speak. So if you could please bring your microphone directly into the camera. We're also doing a digital audio recording, so it's important that we get audio. I think that's fabulous, but we'll get to the Q&A.
yeah, I'll be up.
All right, thank you.
Do whatever you want to. I'll probably.
you're on.
I'll try to say
I like sort of a defensive perimeter myself.
there you go. Just go to the table again. This is the
Yes.
$2 in there.
Yeah, that's a defensive perimeter statement that you can set up.
Wait another couple minutes.
People coming in?
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll start in about another 2 minutes. Thank you.
Just get ready to kick the field goal and they call the timeout. I need one of those things. We need to have a discussion about staff. I don't get anything. I don't get anything. I don't get electronics. I don't, you know. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Mike Swetnam, and I'm CEO and Chairman of the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and it's my privilege and honor to welcome you today to what we think is a really, really important book launch here in Washington, D.C., a book about doctrine, about what is important, what are our goals and our values about a very important topic. Before we start the discussion of policy, let's talk about doctrine and what should underpin policy. Before we get into a discussion and a panel session about this book, though, I would like to first say a couple words about the Potomac Institute. We're a not-for-profit that looks at science and technology policy issues here in the Washington, D.C. area, and therein is one of the main reasons for us being involved in this project, which I have to give almost sole credit to the Battelle Memorial Trust for coming up with the concept, helping to underwrite it and making it happen, and supporting the Potomac Institute and all of us involved in this project to bringing it to this point in the process. And at the Battelle Memorial Trust, a special note to Mr. Tim Sample, my co-editor that's sitting at the table, who through, I think, personal will made this happen in his organization. And in a few minutes, I'll introduce him and tell you a little bit about how he came about that type of personal drive here in Washington, D.C. to make things like this happen. But first, a little bit about science and technology policy, which is what an awful lot of us are about here in this room and at our two not-for-profit institutions. Science and technology, as most of you know, is revolutionizing our world, revolutionizing what it means to be alive and functioning in this world. In fact, revolutionizing what it means to be part of our society, a human being in this world. Every single new piece of science and science that gets turned into technology and then rolled out to us has a seemingly even greater impact on our lives than the last piece of technology. Most of us, except people like Secretary Randy Port in the front row there that we'll talk about more in a minute, did not envision a small little box that would change our lives like this cell phone has today. And as we live and breathe in this world that is enabled by cyber technology, it's not only hard to imagine what we could have done without it, it's hard to understand and embrace how important it is to the functioning of our society today. Few technologies have ever impacted human affairs like that we call cyber today. Most technologies have a very profound good impact and sometimes a bad impact, a yin and yang, if you will, of science and technology. As the science and technology has become more profound, the good and the bad impacts have grown. As I said, I think most of you will agree, the impacts of cyber technology on us individually and us as a society are so profound we could not have imagined them before we actually became a part of them today. And in fact, the impacts are probably just beginning. The way these technologies will change the human race is so profound it's hard to imagine and talk about today. Just as beneficial as this technology is, it has the potential for profound harm. It can be one of the greatest weapons mankind has ever built, if only the ability to deprive us of this technology, we can be threatened greatly by it. So as we embrace what does it mean to develop a doctrine for dealing with this technology, I think we have to first stop and understand this is the ultimate infrastructure. This is the ultimate aid to mankind and an extension of what we want to be and who we want to be. Just depriving us of this capability in the future is a threat that we have to address in a way that protects us and our children and generations to come. I'm sure most of you know and have been following. If you're in this room, you've certainly been following what's been going on here in Washington, D.C. with respect to cyber technology. I don't know how many bills were introduced in the Senate and House this year, but there were a lot of them. None of them made it out. They addressed all different types of issues in and around cyber and all different types of things that cyber addresses and touches from our industry to our government. We're trying really hard to figure out how to develop policy for dealing with cyber. What this effort, what this book was about, the vision that Tim and Battelle brought to the table was the concept that as we start to talk about the policy for dealing with cyber, emphasizing the good and mitigating the bad, let us first start with our, if you will, first principles. What is our doctrine for dealing with cyber? What's important? What should guide us in the development of cyber and in dealing with this new environment that we live in? That was the impetus for this book, and you'll, I think, see as you look through it that we brought together some of the best authors we could find on the planet to, or at least in Washington, D.C., people in Washington, D.C. that think that they are kind of are the planet, but we'll say that there's at least a few good doctrinal people around Washington. We brought them together to address these issues and not to solve the problem, not to give you the answers, not to prescribe the doctrine for cyber warfare, or technology, or mitigations going forward, but to begin the discussion, to begin to discuss the points that we hope were of the most immediate interest, and to involve all of you in that discussion in a way that can lead us to the development of meaningful doctrine followed by implementable policy and hopefully by a more secure cyber world that follows that. We thank you very much for coming here and joining us in getting this book out, getting it done and published. I want to give because it's personal for me, a very warm thank you to the Potomac Institute Press, who actually got the book to happen in terms of ones and zeros and then letters printed on a page represented by my Chief of Staff, Catherine Schuler, here today. If we hadn't gotten that part of it done, we would demonstrate how far behind we are in the cyber realm. But we did get it out. I think it's a good piece of work, and I hope that you'll agree with me that it's the beginning of a discussion that we very, very much need to have. And with that, I can turn the program over to some people who can address this topic far better than me. And I'll start that with my partner in crime in this effort, Mr. Tim Sample. But you don't get just to get it. Tim Sample is one of those guys who helped define what it means in Washington, D.C. to be involved in policy, not as a profession and not as something that we're interested in, but as a passion and as a part of his life. Tim, along with Randy Fort and a few others here in this room, began dealing with the issues of national security policy as young aides and government officials 25 and 30 years ago, and grew up in this town with the idea that it wasn't a job. This was about our security of our country, of our relatives, of our grandchildren, a passion that was more important than earning a living. It was a passion about being involved in something bigger than yourself, being involved in your society and the representation of your society in your government. It sounds a little bit corny, but in fact there was a group of young folks that we were talking about at lunch who really believe that and have grown to embody that in their career, that I think are represented by a number of people that helped us pull together these chapters and that are here today, not the least of which is, as I mentioned a minute ago, Secretary Randy Fort in the front panel here, and Tim Sample. Tim grew up in the CIA, spent a time working on arms control, technology issues, non-proliferation, went out into the civilian world with me for a while and learned that as rough as it was to be a clandestine officer in the CIA, business was worse. And went back into government to an effort to try and have an impact on society. Ended up with a decade on Capitol Hill, where he was the staff director of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and since then has chosen a career in a not-for-profit addressing the science and technology issues that impact on national security as much or more than anything else we've done in our career. It's been a privilege to have known Tim that entire time, been associated with him through most of it, the good parts. I wasn't there when he was in trouble and being arrested and doing those things. With that, my good friend Tim Sample.
Thank you, Mike. And again, welcome to all of you for us, what is a very special day, and I hope the beginning of a special debate that we start here today on the need for a national doctrine for the cyber era. I want to first and foremost thank Mike and the Potomac Institute, as well as the Potomac Institute Press. As Mike said, when I came to him with this idea and needed a way to get some things published, he stepped right in and said, yeah, let's make this happen. And throughout the most of last year, we have been thoroughly dedicated and enmeshed in this effort. There's a lot of other people to thank, and if you just look through the book, you'll see representation from several quarters. Barry Pavel, who couldn't be with us today, but from the Atlantic Council, and they are doing some stellar work on international norms. The Homeland Security and Policy Institute at George Washington University, and Frank Salufo and Sharon Kardash, who have, again, been doing great work in the realm of Homeland Security. We mentioned Randy several times so far. We'll probably continue to do that, but Randy is from Raytheon and devoted time to do a very thoughtful chapter as we went forward. And that really was part of the goal and part of the theme. So let me get into some of that and let you know that the book really is a culmination of the first phase of a project that Battelle has undertaken that we launched over a year ago. The goal was to bring sharp minds together to debate the issues and to work from specific aspects of doctrine. And Mike very succinctly talked about the need for a national doctrine and why it is important. You'll hear that theme throughout, because really one of the things we've done during this whole period is we've had individuals, and I'll introduce Jamie and Ron and David in just a second, but we've had individuals, both authors and part of our core group, who would be around town at meetings, and they would stand up at some of these panels and say, you know, well, what about a doctrine? You'd have senior government officials on the panels. And almost unanimously the response was the same, and that was, yeah, we really need to do that, and we're not doing it today. And the fact is the government works well, or at least works better, when there is a doctrine that is governing where we're going. And without it, we tend to get into situations that we wish we hadn't, and we'll talk about some of that as we go along. But that was the real goal of this book, was to start the debate. And we will have a follow-up that I'll talk about in just a second. But some of you may be asking why Battelle. Mike mentioned that we are also a nonprofit. We happen to be the world's largest nonprofit research center. today. And we pride ourselves not only on our R&D efforts writ large, but on our ability to, A, think 3, 5, 10 years ahead in research and development to really lay the path for areas where the government needs to go, and we'll get there at some point, and B, to bring people together, and we specialize in that. We do that internally with a variety of different disciplines that we bring to a problem, and we also do that with almost all of our research, where we bring people from outside of Battelle in to work collectively, whether it's joint IP development or to solve really hard problems. It is what we do, and we feel we do that very well. This book is a perfect example. If you look through the authors and you look through the contributors list at the end, you see a wide variety of representation from organizations. I mentioned a couple a minute ago, but even from individuals. So one part of the book was an offsite, and if you look at the contributors and the attendees at that offsite, it ranged from people you might expect that have been in government or have been in a variety of positions that are related to government cyber efforts, all the way to the other spectrum where we had a Hollywood producer. And some people might go, "Whoa, that's really odd." Well, you know what? It really resonated within the room when we were at that offsite of the robustness of the differing views. And it really goes to the point that cyber and the issue of cybersecurity and our national security is not solely a government issue. In fact, it is an issue that goes all the way down to the individual citizen. And I think you'll hear some of that from Ron Marks when he gets a chance to speak. But that's really what we were trying to do, or bring several people together. And let me pause right here and introduce the panel, and then I'll wrap up my comments for a couple minutes. First, who is sitting to my left is Admiral Jamie Barnett, and Jamie is a retired from the Navy in the Navy Reserves, and is a cybersecurity analyst, and currently holds the position of Senior Vice President of National Security Policy at the Potomac Institute. Jamie's was not an author of the project. He was one of our contributors at the offsite, and let me tell you, his insights and vision were critical to the debate that we started, and I very much appreciated his presence. His last government position, which he left, less than a year ago, I guess, right? In April, was the chief of the Federal Communications Commission's Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. And in that process, he was active in promoting cybersecurity initiatives and advancing emergency communications capabilities, including some seminal work on public safety with broadband networks. He created the Cybersecurity and Communications Reliability Division, and that alone, I think, speaks to the fact that he is well-versed, certainly within government, on many of these issues, and you can follow him and find some of the things that he's said since then within the cyber realm, and I think you'll find his comments very, very interesting. Next to Jamie is Ron Marks. Ron is president of Intelligence Enterprises, LLC. Ron was also the project director for us for this project, and we were very, very happy that he agreed to do that, and a lot of this would not have been possible had it not been for both Ron's willingness to come over when I called him, and also for his willingness at the offsite to stay up for all-nighters with grad students writing summaries of conversations when we both thought we were well past that phase in our life. And I didn't tell him ahead of time he would have to do that, so that made it all complete. But Ron has had a career in the CIA, serving in the clandestine service. He also was a special assistant to the, at the time, ADCI for military support, and as a Senate liaison to 5 different directors of Central Intelligence. Similar to my background, Ron then took a little turn and wound up on the Hill, where he served as the intelligence counsel to Senate Majority Leaders Bob Dole and Trent Lott. Ron actually now teaches cyber-related issues and has written a couple books on the subject, and I encourage you to Google him and go out and buy those books. Next to Ron is Ambassador Dave Smith, who is the director of the Cyber Center at Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. Dave has had an extensive career in public service and has included arms control experience. In fact, Dave and I we were reminiscing yesterday, we spent several months in Geneva with the nuclear and space talks, having what some might think were thankless jobs at the time, but we certainly felt that they were notable and worthy for the country's security. Over the last few years, Dave has focused on building security and stability in the South Caucasus region, including work on reforming national security institutions in the Republic of Georgia. He also serves as the director of the Georgian Security Analysis Center, and for most of you who follow cyber know Georgia has some very unique experience with cyber and cyber attacks, and so I was very, very happy to see Dave's commitment and willingness to do a couple stellar chapters in the book. Let me get back to some quick comments from my perspective on this effort and on this book, and then I'll turn it over to Jamie. The book really is a call to action. It's highlighting the need for a comprehensive national level doctrine that addresses the challenges that America faces on a daily basis in this world dominated by cyber technologies. We are simultaneously the most advanced and the most vulnerable country when we consider our reliance on cyber technologies. And today, if you look around, we have scads of strategies, policies, authorities, and ideas that are working separately without a common basic framework that would allow our nation to take several significant steps forward in where we need to be in this world. If you think about it, during when we had our last major national doctrine, it was containment, right after World War II, and there was a nuclear component to that. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that Battelle got involved in this project, because if you look back at the early stages of nuclear doctrine especially, but as part of containment, it wasn't the government that came up with the initial framework for a national level doctrine. It was actually the scientists and the academicians and the practitioners that understood the power of the atom, that understood the potential uses and the power of nuclear weapons that actually started that debate. And then the government folded in, and that's how we got the early stages of containment and the nuclear components of that. And we feel that really, if you think about it, we're in a very similar place today. The difference is that as we were looking at the doctrine of containment, we made a decision as a nation, and the decision was that we would take the lead in preventing the spread of communism, and that we had a complete focus from the entire government, throughout the government, all the way down to the individual citizen who felt that they had a contributing role in ensuring our safety. Sometimes that contribution was in civil defense. Sometimes, and some people chuckle about it now, but at the time it was very real, sometimes it was the drills where children got under their desks, you know, to be safe, quote unquote, from a nuclear attack. But the fact is, it was drilled into our consciousness. We understood. We understood that there were certain things the government did, certain things that a citizen would do, and we're not quite in that place today. In fact, today we tend to believe that the government's going to do everything for us in this regard, and although we are worried about our personal safety when it comes to cyber hygiene and our personal accounts, not many people see it as an extension of our national security. And yet, if you think about it, there's more access to various portions of our infrastructure, we can argue whether it's critical or not at various points, by citizens, whether they're paying their electric bill, whether they're doing anything else. There's more access today, certainly, than there was with Americans with access to nuclear weapons. But I would argue that the consequences are very much the same. and we'll get into that during the Q&A. But the fact is that the government works best, in our view, when it actually has a doctrine that leads it forward. Without one, we tend to lurch from crisis to crisis. And I would argue, if you look at the United States, seriously, since the end of the Cold War, and I'm not going to argue the validity of things that we've gotten into, but the fact is we've been in very much a reactionary mode. Something's happened, we're reacting to it. Whether it's terrorism, whether it's the economy, whatever it is, we are in constant reaction, and that's something that cannot be sustained over time to protect our security. You can also argue, if you look at the history, that we've been a reluctant leader. I mentioned that in the early days of when we developed containment, we stepped out. We were going to lead. If you look after the Cold War, we've rarely done that as a nation. And I'm not saying that coalitions are bad, but what I am saying is the thought process that you go through is different if you're going to take the lead and bring others with you, as opposed to, can I get consensus built to go do something? It's a different mindset, and the results are different. And I think that's what we're living through today. Now, this is far from easy. And consequently, what you see are administrations who are well-meaning, but they tend to focus on things they think they can get done as opposed to things that must be done. And that's not, I'm not making a political statement here, it's more of a statement of fact. But all of us have worked in several different administrations, and that's kind of the mindset. How much can I get done in my 4 years? Or if you're lucky, 8 years, right? As opposed to, here's what needs to happen. And what our collective view is, we're at a point now with cyber that we have to stand up and say, here's what needs to happen. And that's going to have to go through development and debate, and it'll carry over through multiple administrations if we do it right. Another point is that the importance of the Internet to our national livelihood cannot be taken for granted. Think about it. If you look at certain things today, Mike mentioned just the development of the mobile device. You look at some of the statistics, even from Black Friday and Cyber Monday. And what you found is that close to, I believe from USA Today, close to a quarter of the retail shopping was done online. PayPal, I believe, had a 200% increase in utilization from the prior year. And so part of our argument that you read in the book is that today the Internet is a utility. You expect to have the Internet just like you expect to have lights or water, right? Our argument is that we're not too far from having the Internet itself as our critical infrastructure. And as that increases in importance, so does our philosophy have to increase as we go forward. We do in the book draw some comparisons to the Cold War and the doctrine of containment, and you find that in some cases, there are some things where you can draw parallels, there's some things that you can't. Issues like attribution and equivalency are very difficult in the cyber era, especially when a bad actor may be an individual or a group as opposed to a nation state. But if you look at some of our policies and some of the things that are ongoing right now within the administration, what you see are we are going to be very well primed and positioned to do traditional nation state type response, less so when it comes to the types of asymmetric issues that we see going forward. The last point I'll make is that the debate does need to be open. It needs to include scientists, academicians, cyber practitioners, industry, government, and individual citizens. Today, the internal debate that's going on within government and the formulation of policy is largely done in secret. And we don't need to debate the existence of tools and techniques, which is some of the fear that's out there by the government. But we do need to debate what the doctrine should contain and how it should be represented in terms of where our country needs to go and where it needs to lead, and what the components of that doctrine should be. Because you think about it, there's very little in our lives that's not touched today, whether it's civil liberties, whether it's just basic safety and security. all of it comes to play within a doctrine for the cyber era. We argue in the book at one point, in fact, Mike and I talked to this in one of the last chapters, that in many ways we're at war today. And the problem is, one, it's an economic war more than anything, I believe, when it comes to cyber. If you just look at the amount of intellectual property that's being stolen from U.S. companies, it is amazing. And General Alexander from NSA speaks to this over and over again. It's costing us hundreds of millions of dollars, and will continue to do so without some sort of a dedicated effort. But what is government's role in that? And that's something that we are constantly trying to grapple with. And the last point in that area is that part of the problem is we have a really hard time today seeing cyber threats as the type of existential threat that nuclear weapons had. And consequently, we tend to feel we have more time. It's not that it's not important, it's just that other things seem to get in the way in terms of priority, right? Because we have time, because nothing's going to blow up tomorrow like a whole city. On the other hand, if you listen to Secretary Panetta, you listen to General Alexander, you listen to Mike Hayden, you listen to Mike McConnell, they are all out speaking the same message, and that message is we are just a glance from going from a hack into a system into something actually blowing up. So the time really is not there, although we tend to think it is. And with that, let me turn it over to Admiral Jamie Barnett for some thoughts on the areas that he is most familiar with. Jamie?
Thanks, Tim. Thank you. So since Tim has limited me to areas that I'm familiar with, this will be very short. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to you and to Battelle and the Potomac Institute for speaking with this group here. And I'm daunted by the group that we have here. It's a very august and knowledgeable audience. I think my purpose is I was not one of the authors, as Tim and Mike mentioned. I was able to be part of the discussion group at the offsite in June of this year, and so got to talk through some of these types of things. And I think my purpose here is to talk about Chapter 15, which in essence is the conference report, and I would commend it to you. As a matter of fact, if you want to read it while I speak, you may end up being better informed at the end of it, because there's not a way to cover all of it, so I'll emphasize just a few points. One of the things that I would emphasize is something that Tim alluded to is the difference between what's being done now as opposed to what really needs to be done. And that is an 800-pound gorilla that's sitting on top of effective cybersecurity efforts. And in some ways, we all contribute to that, whether we're as individuals or as private industry saying, well, I don't want the government involved, or government trying to say I want to be too involved, or the privacy advocate saying I want to make sure privacy is in. I mean, all these are legitimate interests, and they are therefore stakeholders. And I guess the difference now is, rather than us all feeding the gorilla, what we really like to do is to say all of us need to come to the table. We need to have that anvil on which cybersecurity can be hammered out. Part of Chapter 15, I think, revolves around the fact that we don't have a good mental model now for this new domain. But having new domains is not actually unprecedented. It has happened before, and we've had to organize around new domains, such as, and okay, I'm an admiral, right? The sea. The sea, we had ships, we've had for a long time, hundreds and hundreds of years, but it wasn't until new technology, the ability to sail out and navigate back. That was an important aspect of the getting back part, was an important aspect of making the sea economic. This was a new domain, and it became fabulously profitable to those who could do it well. I might add that just as soon as we established that new profession of seagoing people, we developed the second profession, which was piracy, not unlike this domain that we're working on right now. It's interesting that it was not until 1606 that one of the greatest naval powers ever, the British, actually organized, in essence, a Department of the Navy. Our own republic was 22 years old before we had a Department of the Navy. They finally figured, oh, we got to organize around this. And from that, from the British and from the U.S. Navy, yes, policy, but first doctrine developed that made both of those institutions so very successful. And in the case of the British, they dominated for hundreds of years. So how do we get rid of the guerrilla? And what are the things that are happening right now? Tim mentioned that I worked at the FCC. While I was there, we had 3 initiatives. And Steve Crocker is here. He was one of the ones that worked on it. These are voluntary initiatives directed at ISPs and carriers. And I'll just mention them briefly. One was an anti-botnet code of conduct for ISPs. Another one was to try and get DNS, domain name system security, enacted faster. And another one, the initial steps of a secure border gateway protocol, the connection between the 40,000 autonomous systems that are, in fact, the Internet. But all of them were voluntary. Why were they voluntary? Maybe that's exactly what we needed, and I think that's an appropriate place to start. But it was because that was what we could do. And I think what you're seeing with Presidential Policy Directive 20, which I've not seen, but I read an intelligence report on, oh no, I'm sorry, that was the Washington Post. I think what you're seeing in that is the groundwork. I don't know what all's in it. There's implicitly or perhaps explicitly listed in that a recognition that the United States has national interest in cyberspace. Well, I don't know. I think that would be a seminal part or maybe a pre-doctrinal statement that could go forward on this. But once again, is that what must be done, or is that only what we can get done? Same way with the executive order that is circulating that you've heard about. So from the conference, there were some, I guess you'd say, principles developed. Number one, status quo simply is not acceptable. We can't continue to do what we're doing right now, even though, quite frankly, we have been accepting the status quo for too long. I think one of the harsh realities that goes along with that is the private sector, as much as we rely on the private sector, is not providing the level of cybersecurity right now that needs to be. We have to do more than right now. The other thing I think we have to say is nobody thinks that the government can provide cybersecurity. We don't want to turn it over to the government. It doesn't do that well. We must recognize that cybersecurity costs money and that somebody has to do it. The federal government doesn't own cyberspace, and in fact, it doesn't do that well in investing in cybersecurity, except for itself, which quite frankly it should do more of. I think one of the things that came out of the conference is that there clearly needs to be someone in charge. Now, when you think about that, who's in charge of defense for the United States of America? A lot of people have a hand in that, but I think you would look at the Secretary of Defense. Who's in charge of space exploration for the United States? I think a lot of people have a hand in that, but NASA. Who's in charge of cybersecurity for the United States? So the answer to that question, which other one of the 2 ways you might go on that, is either, well, gee, I don't know for certain who all has it, or so many hands go up that it becomes a real problem for figuring out where we go forward. And how do you actually define it? There needs to be someone in charge, and we need to have organs of government. So I might give as one example part of the loss that we have because of the gridlock and because of not doing things, and that is, I mean, we worry about cybersecurity and we have a tendency to think about that as someone breaking into our networks, right? That's kind of the mindset. But a whole area, a whole threat in cybersecurity is also our telecommunications supply chain. That's where your network is the threat. They're already inside. And when I was at FCC, and I realize it now, it continues, nobody in government right now has the authorities to do anything about it. Nobody in government has the authority to do what we need to do with regard to the supply chain. So we have to have the doctrine from these types of things that legislation can flow. We may need to have new organs of government, that person that is in charge. Maybe it's time to actually pull pieces. I wouldn't say grow government, because that would be politically insensitive, but maybe take pieces like NTIA from Commerce and parts of cybersecurity and communications from DHS and put it. Maybe it's time for U.S. Department of Communications and cyberspace and make them responsible, not for cybersecurity, but for creating the market for it. In other words, incentivizing industry, which is and always will be the front line of government. So until we have that doctrinal sense, all of this is going to continue, as Tim mentioned, to be confused and diffused instead of the focused thing that we must have in the future. One of the things that we learn in law school is there's no way to get the right answer unless you're asking the right question. And that's what we have to do as a country, is start asking the right questions. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Ron Marks.
I am the quintessential Washington guy. I am not an expert. I can barely turn on my phone, yet I write and I teach about cyber. Well, what are we going to say about that, right? Let me talk a little bit about some of the more difficult social problems that we're dealing with regards to the internet. This thing, and I'm looking across the room here, so there are a few of us old people and there are a lot of young people out there. So let me describe our presence with the interweb, us old folks, all those tubes floating around and all that. This came up, at least in political time and in economic time, pretty fast in the US. And Washington, D.C. didn't exactly catch on to it fairly quickly. When this was all going on in the 1990s out in Silicon Valley and in the private sector, by and large, Washington, D.C. was not dealing a lot with this issue. I've made a hell of a living over the years replacing, in my job as an IT guy, legacy systems. Legacy systems within the federal government essentially means old stuff that we wired together, made it sort of work for us, and now we've got the problem that we've got this interweb out there that we don't know how to interact with. Washington is not always prepared to deal with these kinds of advanced technological issues, and having spent a little time out in Silicon Valley, I assure you that Larry Ellison and other people with large boats and large houses will be more than happy to tell you exactly why we don't know what we're doing. Here's your problem, and this is a problem for all of us. I mean, I've used a phrase, and my wife cringes at it, but I'll continue to use it because what the hell. We are all cyber citizens here. There's not a person here right now who can't reach into their pocket or go somewhere in this place and catch some Wi-Fi and get on the internet. 10 years ago, more than that now, 15 years ago, when I was working on the Hill for Trent Lott, his fraternity brother, another Mississippian, a fellow named Jim Barksdale, is the head of Netscape. And Jim Barksdale introduced us all to the internet. He hooked it up in our office space. I will tell you, never a more tentative group did you ever see. We're all sort of looking at this thing a little bit like my cats play with a mouse. They're sort of looking at it, trying to figure out what is this thing. And I was thrilled by the idea that I could go on the internet, get to, and again, I'll let the older people explain to the younger people, LexisNexis. And by the Lord God, and I don't know whether one of my good friends was involved in it at that point, but CNN had a website. Holy smoke. I can remember when I sent my first email back in the late 1990s. I remember my first laptop, which was about, about the size of this thing and weighed about as much. That was 2000. And I can remember the miracle at that point of being able to reach out onto the internet. I was writing speeches for a presidential candidate at that point. I never seemed to get winning presidential candidates, but I was writing for one. And the idea that I could write a speech, go out in the net, take some material, and unlike most of Washington, actually give credit to whoever was writing it, and bring it back to that speech. What a wondrous thing that there was that kind of information available. Now to you young guys, this just sounds like, well, yes, so what? But I'm telling you, it's fast in human time. We're talking about less than 10 to 12 years. From a government standpoint, a government that deals, essentially that was built in the 1940s and 50s along staff and line charts, this is just amazing and tough to deal with. You can sit here forever and a day and recite initials of who's involved with this process, whether it's DHS or FBI or, God forbid, my old agency, CIA or FCC or whomever else. Very tactical stuff. But here's your other challenge. Somewhere along the line, our founding fathers, whether we like it or not, assembled a government for the United States. And one of the taskings that they gave it was to provide for the common defense and to promote the general welfare of the United States. Now, it's been interpreted in a lot of different ways over the years. Jamie's old agency, the FCC, was brought in, back in the 30s, essentially to deal with radio spectrum, et cetera. Back in the late 90s, we were dealing with cell phones and all of that business, dealing with the spectrum, the radio spectrum. We haven't quite come to grips as a government as to how to deal with this issue. Now, if you're listening from the Silicon Valley side, and I'm picking on those poor guys, whoever's involved with the internet, this is the case of the child being the father of the man. The internet was developed in freedom, total freedom. It was developed essentially as an academic tool. Security was not something that was high on the agenda. I mean, I've had the honor of dealing on and off a little bit with Vin Cerf. And these guys were initially involved with the internet. They didn't think that millions of messages or billions of messages were going to come across this thing, and they sure didn't think about the spread of it. Somewhere along the line, in the last 4, 5, 6, 7 years, this thing has changed from essentially, isn't this cute, to gosh, this is useful, to a public utility. And the question becomes, how does a government deal with that? Now, there's no one in this room, and I realize we're in industry central here in Washington, D.C., so we're right in the main factory of government here. But I think we've all had enough experience to know at this point that we have to approach this in a different way. If we try to do anything heavy-handed at this point, we're going to basically step on a market that has developed quite well over the years. On the flip side of it, where is this market going? We've had now a market that is really not interested in dealing with security. It's costly. It's a cost center in any organization. It's not something that people, by the way, who are selling this stuff necessarily want to bring up. And oh, by the way, if you want to know the most guilty party in terms of internet security failure, I want you to raise your hand and see if you've downloaded any more security things to your computer since you bought them. About 85%, well, there are one or two good parties here. All right, let me take it back to the last 6 months. All right, well, there are a couple of good guys out here. Stop doing that. For the most part, most of the problems come through small businesses and individuals that are vulnerable. How do you as a government make people behave? Do you want to make a law? Do you want to tell people what to do? You know how successful that's been over time. And what do you do about businesses? Do you put them in a position where if they have insufficient security, they're going to be subject to some form of sanction? These are all questions that we need to address as a government and as a society in the next few years. We've minced around the edges of it. It's difficult. It's sticky. We're talking now not about laws. We're talking about how we use this internet. What kind of level of government involvement do we want with this internet? And by the way, it's already here. The question is how we deal with it and how we impose it within. And by the way, it's going to get imposed to some extent without. As we are sitting here right now, the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, is meeting in Dubai. The American delegation is 155 people. And by the way, there are a number of people who have come, and I'm going to pick on poor Silicon Valley again. Their response to this union, by the way, has been very interesting, as in, well, how can these governments do this to private industry? Welcome to Washington, and welcome to the rest of the world. But again, it's not an industry that's necessarily familiar with this kind of government regulation, and the question is, do we stifle it if we go too far? Internationally, China, Russia, Iran, all those other nice people out there who are not as fond of the internet as we are, wish to impose a set of rules. How do we, as the government of the United States, protecting our people and our businesses, deal with that? And by the way, there's a monetary aspect to this thing, too. If I'm the head of the Kenyan PTT, I'm getting a cut on every phone call that's coming in and out of that country. I'm not getting anything on internet coming in and out of that country. I'm losing revenue. Where is it? You'll notice in the United States as well, people are now talking about sales taxes on the internet. This is a subject we are also going to have to deal with. Are you, again, going to be imposing taxes of sort on the internet? Now, I'm giving you this all in the form of a question, not because I have, essentially because I don't have a clue how to answer it, but also, frankly, these are debatable issues. Because I'm going to go back to the basic premise. Everybody sitting in this room has a stake in this. We have a stake in it in terms of advising our government. We have a stake in terms of dealing with business, if we're business people, and we have a stake of it in terms of dealing with citizens. Because the problem with this thing, unlike the Cold War, and here's where we do differ a bit, this is not a government-only situation. We range essentially from worrying about, there's a division of the Chinese army at this point dealing with cyber issues, down to very angry 14-year-olds somewhere in a basement who want to get even with one of their buddies. Is that a national security issue? What level becomes a national security issue? Is any threat to the internet a national security issue? What about non-nation states? Anonymous, the other lulls out there. These are all questions that have to be dealt with. And we're stumbling forward here in Washington right now because it's easy to fall back bureaucratically. Jamie has it exactly right. We have fallen back in our own institutions here. So we start talking about executive orders, and we talk about which organizations are supposed to do what where. And that's fine. But it only makes sense if there's some kind of doctrine. What is it that the United States wishes to do to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare of its people, of its businesses, of itself on the internet? Thank you.
First chair is thrown.
First chair is thrown out.
Glad I wasn't in that when it went over.
Sorry, Dave, can't come back.
Okay. Well, if I can't come back, well, this will only take 2 hours, so. Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for coming and listening to this, for your interest. I'd also like to thank the people who made this book happen. Each of us wrote, somebody said I wrote 2 stellar chapters. I'm sure they were stellar chapters. But you got to remember that all of those chapters, stellar or not, landed on the desks of Mike Swetnam and Tim Sample and Ron Marks, and they had to deal with all of it and get it put together. So I think we really owe a special thanks to them for actually making this thing happen. A lot harder job than just being the author of an individual chapter, so thank you very much. Well, we've had a couple of ideas about why you need some kind of a doctrine, and it's a pretty simple thing, because somebody mentioned if you don't have some idea of what you're trying to do, you kind of lurch from crisis to crisis. You're never prepared. You never have the training. You never have the operational ideas of how you're going to do it. You don't have the equipment. Whatever you need to do, there's no planning. You can't do it. You've got to have some way of planning for something and thinking. You always have adaptive planning. It's never going to be perfect, but you have to have some sense of what you're trying to do. Somebody mentioned containment in the Cold War. It was pretty easy. You had a Soviet Union. It was really bad. It was trying to expand. What do you want to do? You want to keep it from expanding. It wasn't, I don't mean to belittle all the literature that went on, but, there was a general sense of it was fairly easy to do. This is hard. I don't think it's impossible, but it is hard. I'd like to concentrate on a particular aspect of it, and that is sort of the external side of it. That is, not only do you not know what you're doing if you don't have any kind of doctrine, nobody else knows what you're doing. Your friends and your foes don't really know what you're trying to do. So if you want allies, if you want friends, if you want people to cooperate with you around the world, they've got to know where you're coming from. What are you trying to do here? And if you want to deter something, then you also have to send some signals. You have to prepare for deterrence. Deterrence is not something that just happens. And that's sort of what I'd like to talk to you about today. Now, when you mention the 2 words cyber and deterrence, half the line jumps off sides. And some of them are afraid of the pointy end of the stick. You know, we might be talking about offense, and, you know, maybe we would do something. Well, come on, folks. We're a country that deters with nuclear weapons, for one thing. So let's grow up here. I mean, you know, stop it. The problem is if you don't talk about that stuff, you allow yourself to be poked constantly by others with the pointy end of the stick, and I don't think that's a particularly good alternative for the United States. You know, that's one of the options, or you lurch from problem to problem. You got to plan for this stuff, and I think you can. Some people think it's impossible. You know, why? Because, well, it's hard to do and everything. It's not impossible, and I think there's a couple of points that we have to make about what deterrence was back in the Cold War, and I think there's a couple of fallacies that lead to that sense of impossibility when we look at deterrence in the cyber field. I think there's two fallacies. First of all, there's a sense that in the Cold War it was simple. It was mutual assured destruction, and it worked. Well, folks, it wasn't simple. We have a shorthand called mutual assured destruction. We had nuclear weapons, but we also had conventional weapons. We had a system of alliances. We had German rearmament. We had American sea control. We had public diplomacy. We had regular diplomacy. We had economic development. We had democratic development. There was a lot of stuff that went into deterring the Soviet Union. And by the way, I don't know that it worked. It did not fail. That much we know. And as the archives of the Soviet Union were opened after the fall of the Soviet Union, we learned that maybe we didn't have as much understanding as we thought we had about what deterrence was. And the other thing that I think happens is you always have the tyranny of the new. You know, this is completely new. It's not like anything that's ever happened before. Well, you know, people have been saying that for 3,000 years. You can go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and people were writing that this is all completely new. The older generation doesn't understand it at all. I mean, that's been going on for a long time. Yes, some of the stuff is new. The technology is new. It zips back and forth across borders at the speed of light. That's new. And it involves subnational groups. That's maybe new since 1648, but you know, subnational groups have been part of security for a long, long time. So I don't know that how much is new here when you talk about deterrence. You're still talking about people. You're still talking about strategy. Deterrence, the idea is really not all that new. You're talking about either denying a potential enemy his objective or punishing a potential enemy for doing certain things to you. So what do you need to know? Well, you need to know what are you trying to deter. You need to know who are you trying to deter, and you need to know how. Okay, what? Secretary Panetta says we're being hit with tens of thousands of attacks every day. We are? I mean, that's mind-boggling. Tens of thousands of attacks. Maybe we need a definition of the word attack. You know, tens of thousands of things. I'm not debating what Secretary Panetta is saying. Tens of thousands of non-cooperative cyber events are happening every day. That's certainly true. Do we want to call all of those an attack? I think we probably don't. So let's kind of make a pyramid. Up at the top, we've got stuff that's, it actually has a physical effect. We saw that with Stuxnet. We saw it with the Aurora experiment. It is possible to make something go boom with a computer. That can happen. We can talk about other kinds of effects. We're talking about loss of life, if we're talking about mass evacuations, severe economic damage to the United States, national security. It seems to me we need to kind of think of those as what we mean by an attack. It seems to me that's something we would like to try and deter if it's possible. At the bottom end, let me skip the middle for a minute. At the bottom end, I think we could probably all agree, everybody gets those emails, right? Dear sir, we have researched your reputation and your business, and we have decided that you are a person of respect who can help us. Until recently, my father was the governor of the Kogi State Bank. Okay, this is probably not a threat to national security. I think we could probably agree. It's a law enforcement issue. I'm not belittling it. Carters, all of these things, these are problems, and we need to fight those things. But I think we probably shouldn't be talking those as national security attacks. I think we can probably push those off into we either write them off or we fight it with law enforcement. Then there's this middle issue. Most of what Secretary Panetta is really talking about is computer network exploitation. It's espionage. Somebody's coming in there and they're taking stuff. Okay? This is really important. We shouldn't belittle it. There's a lot of this stuff going on. Okay. Now, there's some people who write about this subject. So, well, you can't deter that stuff. There's too much of it. It's not casus belli anyway. It's not a cause for war under international law. I think we need to think about it. Stalin is said to have said that at a certain point, quantity has a quality all its own. Okay? We're not talking about James Bond with a cigarette lighter. That was kind of cool. We're talking about a massive robbery of American intellectual property. We're basically funding the research and development for the People's Liberation Army and the armies of the Russian Federation, and maybe a few others. Now, that's serious, if that's really what's going on. And we say we can't deter that. I think we can. I think if you put it all together, you need to start sending some messages. Yes, you know what it may take? It may mean that Americans in the short run are going to pay more for televisions and washing machines and refrigerators. But if it's really that serious, maybe we need to start thinking about certain measures which will deter that. It's a hard question, but I submit to you I don't know the answer, but I think we need to start thinking about what to do about it. So what do we need to do, at least at the top of the pyramid? What has to be done? Well, first of all, you need exquisite intelligence. You need to know what people are doing to you, who's doing it, where is the stuff coming from, what's going on. You need a declaratory policy. Deterrence works on a declaratory policy. If you do these things, we will do bad things to you. You don't have to be explicit. If you do this, we will do exactly that. But you need to be pretty firm about something will happen to you. You need the capabilities to do those things. You can't just say blah, blah, blah. You need the capabilities. You need a full range of capabilities, and you need the demonstrated will. Why did deterrence work? Why? Because we did nuclear tests that people saw. Because we did military operations that people saw. The Berlin airlift was a major issue. We showed the resolve not to cave into Soviet aggression. It's very important that you show that you actually have the capability and you have the will. So what do you have to do? It seems to me you need a full range of capabilities. At the bottom of the spectrum, and that part that you hope to use most of the time, are those normal diplomatic, economic, political kinds of actions that you hope will deter most of the activities that you don't want to have happen most of the time. You'd like to keep this as far away from the pointy end of the stick as you possibly can. I would suggest to you that we do need some kind of a cyber deterrent. Why? Because if those measures fail, that economic, political, diplomatic, do you want to jump right to military? We have no other options. It seems to me as part of the ladder of escalation, you want to have some capabilities where you can, in fact, retaliate in kind. That doesn't mean it's always possible. It doesn't mean it's always appropriate. Not every force that we built during the Cold War was going to be useful in every instance. And I don't think cyber weapons are going to be useful in every instance. But I think it would be more useful than not to have certain kinds of capabilities. So it seems to me if you look at where we are today, we have a policy. If you read the President's international strategy on cybersecurity, it says the United States reserves the right to defend itself in whatever means I'm paraphrasing here, that it sees fit against an attack on the United States. I mean, we've got that much. What I don't think we have is all the rest. We don't really have a sense of we have the capabilities, we exercise the capabilities, we're sending you the message, certain things will happen to you if you do these things. It seems to me that what's missing here is the capabilities, the demonstrated capabilities, and the resolve. Do we really have the will? That's what really has to be developed. Okay, let me just conclude with a note on attribution, because when you get into this issue, everybody's out, not everybody, but a few people in the room are saying, well, it's attribution, you're not going to know against whom to retaliate. Well, I think there's a few things that we have to look at. You've got to be very careful that the attribution thing doesn't lead to what is frankly a sterile and paralyzing debate where we just can't get anywhere. Attribution is very important, absolutely true. But computer forensics is more effective than people think. Maybe not in real time, but the reality is, if you really work at it, there's a lot of things you can find out with computer forensics. You eventually can get beyond the teenagers in Peru and back to wherever this started. Secondly, if you develop that exquisite intelligence, if you really study your adversaries, not just there's adversaries out there and everything is just one big deterrent thing and everything is a lesser included case of China, but you really start studying which nation state, which subnational group, what are their interests, what are their values, what are their vulnerabilities, then you have the capability of taking a look and understanding what's going on. And you have to look at the context. I think too often when people talk about attribution in this business, they're looking at a screen and they're saying, I can't prove who it is. Well, come on, folks, life doesn't work that way. Take a look at, somebody mentioned I'd been involved in the Russian attacks on Georgia. You know, come on, it didn't happen in a vacuum. Yes, it did come through some teenagers in Peru, but the reality is, I mean, you kind of knew what was going on. As the Russian tanks were rolling through the Roki Tunnel, I don't think it took a lot of analysis to figure out where the cyber attacks were probably coming from. And if you know how Russia works, you also understood who those youth groups and who those criminal groups were and who they were working for and how this was going down. You don't look at it just on a screen. You have to look at it in the geopolitical context. You have to use the forensics. You've got to use the intel you have and put the whole picture together. Otherwise, you will never come out of that conundrum. And then I think there's something I'd like to point out. Jason Healy from the Atlantic Council has pioneered this concept of national responsibility. And I think it's something that really needs to catch on. At some point, you have to say, you know what, I'm not going to worry about attribution. I'll do the best I can, but I'm not going to push this to the nth degree. I'm going to hold countries responsible for what's going on inside their borders as a matter of policy. If you didn't do it, then you owe me some cooperation to figure out what's going on. Now, let's go back to the history with the Russians. When the Russians attacked Estonia in 2007, the Estonians requested their cooperation under a mutual legal assistance treaty. The Russians refused and said that wasn't covered. Okay, it seems to me that needs to tell you something right there. When you go to a country and you say, we see this coming from your territory, and they didn't do it, then they say, you know something, we didn't do it. We can either have these capabilities, we can try and investigate it, or we don't have the capabilities. Please, could you send the FBI? Could you send some people to help us out? You know, that's one thing. We don't want to talk about it. That's another thing. And it seems to me we need to start holding countries responsible for what goes on in their territory. It's a different form of deterrence, because what you're basically saying is, if you don't behave responsibly as a nation state, we will hold you responsible for that. Whether you did it or you didn't do it, whatever the thing happened in the first instance was, in the second instance, we asked you to cooperate and you refused to cooperate. And it seems to me the United States is big enough and powerful enough and patient enough, by the way, that it can make that kind of a policy stick. So what I'm really saying here is, in the end, this is not going to be easy. Deterrence was never easy, and by the way, it fails. In the chapter that I wrote in the book, I go back 2,500 years. Deterrence fails. I didn't do year by year, I mean, but deterrence fails, and you have to be prepared for deterrence to fail. But it doesn't fail all the time. And to the extent that you can stay away from the pointy end of the stick, the better off you are. So I think it's worth doing. I think it's possible. But I'd like to underscore the point that I think just about every other speaker has made. This has got to be an open debate. One of the problems it seems to me we have in cyber doctrine, developing a cyber doctrine, having a policy, knowing what we're doing, is that all of this is going on in secret. That's not how the atomic debate went. We didn't debate the plans for nuclear weapons and operations and locations and targets and that sort of thing. But the debate about doctrine, what are we trying to do with these new weapons, was a very, very open debate. It took place in the newspapers, in the scholarly journals, in speeches, all over, and we gradually developed a doctrine which then, of course, evolved over time. And it seems to me that's kind of missing here, and I think that's what we're trying to do with this book, is to kick off something that doesn't have to expose classified information or sensitive things, but we really need a debate. With that, I will conclude. I hope you found this interesting. Thank you very much.
Randy, would you be interested in making a comment? Ladies and gentlemen, former Assistant Secretary of State Randy Fort.
Oh, well, thank you, Mike. I think the audience will be pleased to know I did not come with my, 35-page set of remarks. The one thing that, and I think just to kind of pull a thread together here, that this, as we've looked at this, and I actually lived it when I was in government in the prior administration and responsible for cyber policy at the State Department. It's awful hard to define policy or doctrine or come up with solutions to these issues while these issues are moving and growing and evolving and metastasizing at such a frantic, rapid pace. And I think Ron made the point that, a dozen years ago, I had one of the very first of these, a BlackBerry, 1998. Because the company I worked for was an early stage investor in RIM. So we got a couple of thousand of the first BlackBerries. I used to walk down the street here or even in New York with, in a terminal or something and on my BlackBerry, and that was an object of conversation. That would stop people in their tracks. What is that? What are you doing? Oh my God, email on something that small? Let me see that. How does that work? It was phenomenal. And now it is so commoditized to be the point of routine, we don't even think about that at this point. And that was just a dozen years ago, barely more than a dozen years ago. And the Moore's Law progressions that we're dealing with. How many people in this room know what a zettabyte is? An exabyte. We're already, you can go out commercially and get tera-scale trillions of bits of information storage at commodity prices. We're in the realm of petascale computing now, quadrillion calculations per second. We're only a few years away from exascale, quintillion per second. We're storing zettabytes of data, septillion. They didn't have a number for 10 to the 28th a while ago. They only went up as high as 10 to the 24th of the yottabyte. They had to invent whole new prefixes for these numbers because that's where the technology is going. You think about the scale of this. And then the tools that are developing as a result of these technologies and this computational power, now with the social media, which we all think of as Facebook and Twitter and, oh, isn't that nice? But, this is not a telephone. This is a personal tracking device. And we all have them. And we're all generating those petabytes and exabytes and zettabytes of data about us and who we associate with. And the algorithms that are associated with those devices are going to become predictive. They're predictive today. Why do you think you got a certain set of emails on Friday and Saturday and Monday after Thanksgiving? It wasn't random. It was because your every purchase, your every geolocation, your every movement is known and tracked and assessed and qualified, and information is being pushed to you. And increasingly, this is the world we're going to be living in. And so there are incredible privacy and personal liberty implications behind this, which we haven't really talked about, but which are profound. Who controls this data? There are intelligence implications to this. When you think about all of this information that resides on databases about all of us, that information is just as accessible to the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians as is the intellectual property. So to be able to target individuals for whatever type of exploitation or action, the implications of this are really profound. And all of this is going on at Moore's Law progressions. That is, it's doubling in effectiveness, doubling in capacity at constant cost every 12 to 18 months. You can't get a policy decision through the U.S. government in 12 to 18 months. It is impossible to go through all of that staff structure that Ron mentioned that is, 1940s, maybe Eisenhower 1950s genesis. And former Deputy Secretary Land acknowledged it takes, on the order of 82 months to do an IT acquisition in the Department of Defense, and that's probably about average for the federal government. 82 months, 6.75 years, that's about 3.5 more law cycles, which means the government is going to constantly be challenged to stay up with state of the art and be current. And so all this is going on. I mean, how do you sail a boat while you barely have the keel laid and you've launched it and you haven't even gotten the fundamental sides and spars and masts and hull and all of that together, and you're expected to go out and start sailing that ship and be able to operate it at maximum speed. We really don't have a good way to think about doing that, and yet the technology is relentless. It just keeps going, and pretty soon we'll all be talking about, oh, you know, I just got my new petascale, you know, device here. It'll be 1 billion times better than what we have today. I'm not making a number up. It's literally within 20 years we'll be dealing with billion-fold increases in capability, according to some of the various futurists out there. And meantime, policy is still trying to, well, you know, we need to pass the appropriation amendment to the markup on the CR on the thing, and you know, we're going to have another subcommittee meeting on that and have a hearing. And the technology will just be continuing going along and accelerating in those capabilities. So I think the effort of this group to begin to put some framework around that and to begin to pose some of those questions and give a way to think about that as this continues to grow at such a fast and furious and in some cases frightening pace is a good first step. And so I commend Potomac Institute and Mike, and certainly the Battelle Institute for being the catalyst behind this, and Tim's leadership to at least put something on the table that here's a framework that we can begin, within which we can begin to work and hopefully begin to address some of these, some of this dynamism that is driving us forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. With that as a really short 45-minute stage setter, we open the floor to questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a microphone for questions.
Sir.
If you'd like to step up to the microphone.
My name's Charlie Hymack. I'm a retired Air Force colonel, and I didn't read your book, so I can ask this question in complete ignorance. And that is, since you're all talking about doctrine, my question is, what is the doctrine for? Is it for defense? Is it for use? Is it for operation? Is it for exposed vulnerabilities? Or is it for deterrence? Go back to the exposed vulnerabilities, for instance. If the electric grid is becoming totally dependent on cyber with no mechanical backup, why shouldn't we have a doctrine that says mechanical backup ought to be available? In the case of deterrence, for instance, do we need to have a doctrine that says you have to have minimum essential capability available? For instance, in the nuclear environment with the Soviet Union, it wasn't the weapons out there on the submarines or in the silos or on the bombers. It was the fact that we could detect a Soviet attack and that there were 5 ways of getting the emergency action message out. They knew they're going to get the whole 9 yards right down their throat. So you had deterrence. The question is, do you need a doctrine for deterrence against cyber attack that's similar?
Let me make a short, uninformed comment, and then I'll turn it over to the real experts to answer your question there. I would say yes, 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 yes. We do need all of those things, but I would distinguish between a doctrinal statement that says all men are created equal, and we believe that you have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as a doctrinal statement, and distinguish that from I'm not going to edit your remarks that you put in the newspaper. So there's a level down where you have policy and implementation of doctrine and reflect that doctrine into a whole bunch of procedure. At the high level, doctrine is more a statement of what we believe, the principles by which we're going to base our actions on. So yes, we need all those actions, but I think it's, and part of our statement here is we're out there trying to develop actions and policies and procedures without first articulating the prime directive, if you will, that we want to hang these laws and policies on.
We are going to have the push and shove between those people who say, oh, this is policy, and those that say it's doctrine, and you can't separate them. It's sort of like the military. You have people talk about tactics, but sometimes tactics are strategies, and then they talk about strategies, but it's really a tactics.
And hopefully those are connected.
Yes, right.
No, and this is the problem, again, back to the Washington thing, because, I mean, we live in this, let's face it. I mean, you and I grew up in this, and we're inclined to talk about what's essentially, I'm going to stretch some terms here, but, you know, tactical doctrines. I mean, in the sense of we're used to saying, you know, in the intelligence community, I'm worried about what intelligence does, what the focus is. I think when we sat down to really hash this out, the idea was to have, as Mike was saying, the overarching statement. What is it that we want to do? Remember, I mean, and again, I thought Tim hit it on the nose in terms of bringing it back to containment. Because from containment, from that basic statement, everything flowed. The diplomacy, the military, the intelligence, all the things that we needed to do one basic thing, which is we were going to contain the Russians, we're going to try to roll them back, and we're going to keep them from rolling forward. So that allowed us that ease. Now, the challenge on this one is it's more complicated in a lot of ways, in part because civil defense was a small part of what we did in terms of containment. How do we involve the population in this? This is much different. The population in this and the business part of this thing is, in fact, the dog. We're almost the tail on this thing. In fact, we are in many ways. So the question becomes, you know, what basic statement do you want to make? We need to deal with this, but what basic statement do you want to make? And then from there move on. And I think one of the challenges for Washington right now is we don't have that basic statement. To do everything is to do nothing. And we want to do everything right now, and that's just not cutting it right now.
Can I add something?
Sure.
First of all, Charlie, thanks for coming. It's good to see an old friend. We worked together for years. I would echo what Mike said, and when you went through that list of things, the answer is yes, 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 yes. It's all of those things. But I think the basic objective is the national security of the United States. Now, you know, that's fuzzy around the edges, probably, what's in and what's out. But in general, we could probably come up with a pretty good idea of what's a national security issue and what isn't. The reason I think you need a doctrine, and you're absolutely right, in Washington, you're always going to have, is it doctrine, is it policy, is it tactics, whatever, you know, and that's just a perennial debate, and you're always going to have that. But I think the point I would make is, I don't know if we need a mechanical backup in our electrical grid, but you're never going to get to that question unless we have some sense that the protection of the electrical grid is a U.S. national security issue, and cybersecurity means protecting the electrical grid, and then we can have a discussion, what is the best way to do that? And I think we don't get there. It's just a series of one-off moves if we don't actually get down to some statements. Maybe we do need a mechanical backup, but I don't think we're ever going to ask the question until we have a sense of why we're asking the question.
And Colonel, if I could pile on, so what you refer to, we'll use that particular example. I mean, here's the thing. What you just articulated is something that currently industry is not providing. Why not? It costs money. Who's going to make them? Is government? Well, now you're tripping across what the status quo is. Government's going to get involved. This goes back to what Randy said. We need to make sure that the principles articulated that underpin that doctrine do what everybody does best. Private industry, front line. They do cybersecurity lots better than the government does. What does government do? Well, government can actually create the market by creating incentives to have those backups, whether mechanical or otherwise. And that's where government needs to be. But we're not doing that yet. And that's why we need to have the overarching doctrine from which policies and laws and authorities can be hung.
Anyone wants to line up for the microphone to say?
The queue starts.
We place that pillar right there to keep the line short.
Gives us the illusion there are only one or two people up front, so.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Larry Jargino. I'm also a defense alumni of sorts. I guess I think this problem is attackable, certainly from a larger scale perspective. But if we're going to do it as a society, it would seem that, and I don't know what's in the book because I haven't looked at it, but we need to be able to articulate the national character, our values and norms in the society that are going to be reflected in this doctrine. If we don't start more fundamentally there, we're going to miss this. We're going to be led by the intelligence community with a Faraday cage around their head, worried in the paranoia of the modern era, and we're going to miss it. And the national debate that you're trying to foster in this very fractious society like we've just watched in the national election won't be robust enough to solve the problem. So somebody in your institute or elsewhere needs to begin to put together a straw man that says, here's the foundation from which we can begin to have this dialogue in order for it to be productive. That's a comment, I guess.
Noted that I did not pay him to say that. In fact, what you just articulated is what I would call phase 2 of our project. It is the next phase of this is to actually take that step. We're going to draw, we started with a group of authors and a group of others that came down, and we started a debate in this arena, the results of which you see in this book. Phase 2 is we're going to start just what you talked about. We're going to be bringing groups together to start a debate on several different areas, because it is, in fact, about our national character, and that's what's missing. If you look at the newspaper reporting, if you look at the statements that are being made by government officials and everything else, there is an assumption that at the end of the day, if something happens, we'll default either to the military or to Homeland Security, or pick an agency, which in and of itself is one of the problems, right? What we've been doing from the emergence of Randy's first BlackBerry onward is we have been trying to shoehorn the authorities and the responsibilities into a Cold War bureaucratic structure because it's easier to think about, but it's really not the way to do it. So it is about national character. And that's one of the reasons that we launched this project, and we are going to continue down that road for the precise reasons that you articulated.
And are you saying, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would add, though, the way you started your comment off about doctrine and those types of things coming from the intelligence community and the intelligence world. As a former intelligence officer amongst a bunch of former intelligence officers, I would comment that this is supposed to be a public debate. If we ever in this country default to having our doctrine come from our secret agencies, we will have lost what it means to be America. So let's keep the debate out in the bright world of sunshine where we are today.
Well, we've more or less failed at that in the war on terrorism. So that's my caution, and that was my initial concern. We're going to duplicate that debate and fail in a similar way.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Agla. I work at CNSDC and I focus on nuclear issues, so perhaps in some way my perspective is informed by that. But I had a question specifically to the ambassador because I thought that you addressed some very relevant aspects. When you talk about the communication of the credibility of the deterrent, in what way do you envisage doing that in cyber? I mean, when you think about the nuclear, you know, we do test simulations these days, and that is considered sufficient to convey the continuation and the credibility. So do you, I don't know, public demonstrations of some factory being destroyed with a computer, this is what you can do, is that what we're after? And then sort of on top of that, to build on the previous question a little bit, when we're talking about the gradation of response and the growing proportionality. So if somebody attacks us, let's say, as the usual example, with messing with the traffic lights, massive casualties, is that what we're going to respond to? My question would be, how are you going, what is the idea about the gouging of the acceptable, publicly acceptable response to events like that? I mean, is there a debate going on with the society? Are we thinking about it as it reflects on the character? So that would be it for me. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your kind words. Well, you've raised a lot of issues, and all of them very good ones, and I think this is part of what we need with the debate. You don't get into this. Let me take them in sort of in reverse order. What are we going to do if somebody turns out all the traffic lights? I don't know. We're going to have a massive traffic jam. What do we do about it? I don't know. I think there's two issues that I think that answer your question.
Those are people who are on PEPCO probably could answer that question. Sorry, PEPCO.
Yeah. Yeah, and we might not. Would we know? But no. The answer is I don't know. Part of it has to be defined in this process that we're talking about. What is the national security of the United States. Is a few traffic lights going out in Cincinnati the national security of the United States? Probably not. Is every traffic light in the country going out a national security issue of the United States? Probably it is. You know, I think you have to look at those kinds of definitions, and you also have to leave something to the policy of the day. I mean, you do have a commander-in-chief. You cannot sort of predict every single thing and create a matrix and say, you know, if 73 traffic lights go out in 10 major cities, the United States will. I mean, that's just, you're never going to get to that. So I think it has to be talked about what is U.S. national security, but I think some judgments obviously have to be left to the people in command at the moment. Okay, what do we do for credibility? Well, first of all, you have to have a declaratory policy, and you don't get a declaratory policy without some kind of doctrine. What are you trying to do? And it seems to me that's part of what we're trying to do here. The declaratory policy has to be very firm. You don't have to declare every intention. As I said, you don't necessarily have a matrix that says, if you do this, we will do that. In fact, I think that's probably undesirable. But what do? Well, first of all, you mentioned nuclear testing. And now we do simulations, and we believe that is sufficient. I don't know who we is. I'm not sure that that's sufficient. You know, I think we used to demonstrate those things. I'm not sure that that's sufficient. I don't know how credible that is around the world today. I think you have to think about not only with your nuclear weapons, but with any kind of weapon, whether it's sea power. You know, what happens? Well, an aircraft carrier battle group shows up off somebody's shore. Certain things happen. I think one of the problems we have right now is because we're not really sure in this post-Cold War era what it is we're trying to do, it's not really clear when a sort of an implicit threat or an explicit threat is issued from Washington. Are we serious? What will we do? And I think that's something that needs to be shored up, not only for cyber, but for many, many things. But yes, if you're talking about certain things, look what you had with, for example, CHAMP. There is a demonstration of something we're working on. Yeah, if it's cyber, I think it has to be demonstrated in some way. Talking about it, theorizing about it, saying what we'll do to you will be very, very, very bad is not going to be sufficient. It's not going to deter anybody. So I think that's the only way you're going to enhance your credibility is you've got to show you have things. But yes, you have got to show that you are serious. And there's various ways of doing that, but talking about it is not one of them.
You sort of hit on the nose on something that really hurts on this issue, which is that the separation between what we would consider law enforcement issues and the national security issue that we were used to dealing with in the Cold War is not there. This is a full-scale spectrum now, and I think one of the challenges in Washington has been we've been conflating a lot of this. You know, does it matter if a kid in a Chinese internet cafe in Shanghai decides to download things from the DoD internet? Is that a national security concern? You know, is someone who from an anonymous group who suddenly shuts down as a denial of service a department of the United States government, is that a national security concern, or is in turn that as a law enforcement? I'm not giving you an answer on this one. Part of it is, again, I will go back to our lack of experience on this. We've really only been dealing with this for about the last 5 or 7 years. It's a tough call. And a lot of the experience in dealing with this kind of thing resides in a cyber command or in an NSA. And it's been hard so far. Not hard, it's just that there's some questions now. How do you, using a term, how do you download this? How do you give state and local authorities perhaps the kind of information that they need to have? And by the way, they do work in this area. How do you download that kind of information that may provide you some more insight into the protection or prosecution of this kind of thing? Again, something I think we learn as time goes forward, but I think it's also framed much better when you have a doctrine that defines for you what the role of the government is. And we don't have that right now.
And let me also add that the reason this is so vexing, especially during this period, is, as both Dave and Ron pointed out, it is not understanding what the thresholds are at this point in ways that were in some way more simplistic during containment in the nuclear age than they are today. Let me give you an example that in the chapter that Mike and I did toward the end we talk about, and that is, you know, I would argue that today there are certain companies and corporations on an international scale that are more powerful than governments. I would argue that Google and probably Microsoft are two at the top of my list that probably have better and more access to certain governments around the world than the United States government has. All right, one of the things we put in the book is that's a different dynamic than it used to be, right? And what happens if, for example, and I'm going to say this without defining what war is at the moment, but what happens if two corporations internationally go to war against each other? And oh, by the way, part of the result of that is that several of our defense contractors start being taken apart. Well, what's our response? Is that you know, hey, do we nuke somebody, and who? And it wasn't that long, if you go back and read the media accounts and the declaratory policy going to the need for a doctrine. It was a couple years ago that the Pentagon announced, and it's also in the national strategy, that you know, if we come under significant attack, significant kind of fuzzy on the definition, we will respond and retaliate with every means appropriate, including nuclear. So what's that mean? I can kind of rationalize that for a nation state, okay? If I have, you know, 3 kids in a garage and I can pinpoint that garage and I can't quite get their system taken down, but they're taking down the entire eastern seaboard's, you know, electric supply, am I going to nuke that garage? Kind of doubt it. So the problem is, without really thinking through this and being able to define what our doctrine is in a better fashion, there's a credibility issue on those declaratory statements. And I think that goes to what Dave was saying right at the beginning.
By the way, one quick observation on credibility. I would say that whoever developed Flame or Skywiper probably has some street cred out there. I don't know who that was, but that would be something, if we're worried about the United States already having established that, I don't think we need to worry about it. So.
Let me, one last comment. We'll try not to answer every question this extensively, but last comment, then we'll go on to the next question. For a lot of these declaratory statements on doctrine, it's easy to say, oh, it's just simple. If you attack me, in any way, I consider that an act of war, and I'm going to come get you. And in the cyber realm, it's important, I think, to note that it's never that simple. If somebody attacks you and you notice that and people die and buildings come crashing down, it's a pretty obvious thing. But what if they don't attack you? What if all they do is put in place the ability inside all your infrastructure to take it down if they wanted to at some point in the future? It's all benign, nothing's happening, nothing's being taken down, it's just sitting there. Now all of a sudden you're very vulnerable. Was putting those vulnerabilities in the system an act of war? If we don't tell the world, if we don't declare to the world that putting vulnerabilities into our system is an act of war, well, they're certainly going to do it. They're probably going to try and do it anyway, but if we don't declare it as something we're going to react against, we're probably inviting them to do it. Sir.
I'm Amar Khan. I'm a writer and linguist. I would please like to ask, cybersecurity is a major area now of concern. But cyberspace is the most secure place for terrorists, convicted felons, and all kind of, you see, even child predators. So is it at all possible to have access to cyberspace limited? This is my one question. Number two, what I heard from you guys today is that in case of a cyber attack, there seems to be no agency or no organization which will be held accountable. This is one thought in my mind. And third is, you see, I see there is still this mindset of the Cold War that a cyber attack will come from across the border. Cyber attack can happen from inside also.
Now, those are all very good points, and let me start with the last one, which is absolutely, and that's why the subheading of this book is No Borders, No Boundaries, going to exactly to your point, that a cyber attack, in fact, can come from anywhere. It goes to, in part, a issue of attribution, and David Oxsmith from Microsoft wrote a wonderful chapter, Chapter 1, on attribution, on the difficulty therein. In terms of securing the Internet, one of the dilemmas that you, in fact, do have is, number one, nobody really understands the full extent of the Internet. I mean, it has gone so far beyond its original conception, and this is in part some of the dilemma. Even with those who are charged with responding, the unintended consequences are still not really known. And so that's the first part of the issue. The second part of the issue is, I don't know if you can secure the Internet from terrorists or from others without significantly crippling what you want the Internet to do. Again, it's an unknown that needs to be discussed, debated, but I would also argue that another factor of that is how we handle cybersecurity today. And I didn't mention this before, I'll mention it now. Part of the issue that we're going to be looking at very closely going forward is the serious need for a national level research and development program on cybersecurity. Why? Well, for one reason, as long as the method of securing what you do is based on signature-based security, you're always reacting, you're always playing catch-up, no matter what. And so there's always vulnerabilities. And if you take that as the premise, it's very hard to protect and it's very hard to secure something like the Internet. So that would be my initial response.
May I add something? You know, to answer your first question, I think it's not possible. I think it's not necessary, and it's certainly not desirable, going back to the point that was originally made about American values, to limit access to the Internet. There are bad things out there. There are bad people out there. There are bad countries. There are bad groups. We know that. But we also know they're walking right down here on the street. We don't have the police blocking off 14th Street. We limit access only to those people whose access needs to be limited. And that's a tough job, but I think you have to go out and figure out what people are doing and go after them. And there's ways of doing those things. You raise a very good point. This is an inside-outside threat, but it's also not the first time we've had inside threats. They don't move at the speed of light. It's not, you know, but the reality is we've always had that situation. And the difference is, I think we should acknowledge that there are national security threats to the United States that emanate from inside the borders of the United States. And I think since 9/11, you know, before we had this kind of fortress idea that, you know, bad things happen outside of the United States, I think after 9/11 we got the point that bad things came into the United States and then actually had a base of operations inside the United States and did harm to the United States. I think we understand that now. The tough thing is going after them, figuring out who they are, and then we do have a legal system. There are people who have different rights when they are on the soil of the United States, but I think you can work around all of that. But I think that's all got to go into what we're talking about. That's part of the doctrine, that there are threats that come from the United States, and how do we deal with those? And some of them are not just law enforcement, somebody stole something, somebody committed fraud or something. Some of this stuff is really serious, and it's a national security threat.
And if I can just add something Dave said, we have, God love us, we have this wonderful way of rationalizing what we do in many cases. And Ron brought up earlier the issue of national security and law enforcement, things like that. Go back, if you will, and this is the reason for the debate, go back, if you will, to the Oklahoma City bombing. In the first 24 to 48 hours, that was a potential terrorist attack. That quickly got turned around to a heinous crime because somehow we felt better about that. We didn't have a domestic terrorism attack. Thank goodness we had a heinous crime, right? I mean, it's, and I don't mean to make light of it, but we tend to, that's part of the dilemma that we face with law enforcement versus national security, is how you characterize this thing. Now it's a little more comfortable, if you will, to talk about domestic terrorism. We've been attacked on our shores, and you can argue, yeah, that was Al-Qaeda and they came in and all that, but the fact is everything started right here. So it's part of the dilemma, and again, part of the reason for the debate.
Ben Shepherd from the Potomac Institute and Institute for Alternative Futures. A question for Tim Sample. You mentioned at the beginning that the Battelle takes up to a 10-year outlook on what it needs to do in the evolving environment. Given the uncertainty and complexity of the cyber environment, should we start to turn to more innovative approaches? So, for example, maybe using scenarios, looking at the political, regulatory, societal, and threat environment to create effective, robust strategies. I'm not talking about what can go wrong, but what a surprising, successful strategy could look like. From that, you could define a clear, compelling vision, and from that, maybe flow down, develop a doctrine which can evolve, which we can all speak to and follow. Have you been involved in scenario development, or if not, maybe this is one potential avenue that we can create a stimulating discussion to say, what do we need to look at given the high-paced environment we're dealing with?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. And I'll start out by saying when I talked about taking like the 10-year view, I was referring at first more to how we approach our research generally, right? You have to do the near term and the long term. The difference is from a research standpoint, purely as in tools and techniques and that type of thing. What you see today, the emphasis in government spending, what we're doing is in essence playing catch up, right? We're doing everything we can. We are the little Dutch kid with our fingers in the dike, and we're trying to plug all the holes so that we can be as safe as we possibly can. What we're doing is saying that's great, and there are a lot of great companies and people out there that are doing that. We're contributing, but we're really looking farther down the road. Going to the second point, though, in terms of looking at what I would characterize as scenario-based planning and the type of approach that you talk about, been involved in some of that, but we're hoping, and in fact, part of that discussion at our offsite is that is a viable way to look at some of this. And so as we go through like a second phase of this, that's one of the things I have in mind to incorporate in there. Because you're right, there are certain areas where you can look at scenarios and help you develop both policies and ultimately doctrine as you go forward in certain aspects. The caveat that I would make is that's very good, and if you take the military example, it's extremely effective if you talk about it's almost like a sub-doctrine, right? The military has been phenomenal over the years in developing military doctrine, how you're going to employ your forces, how you're going to fight together, how you're going to do this, that, the other, right? And that's great. And I think those types of analyses and scenarios work very well there. And I think we need to do that on various aspects, including the law enforcement aspect. You have to start, though, if you don't have an idea of where the country needs to go or where it's going to lead, then it's hard to put the rest of it in place. And I think what we're talking about here as a first measure is you have to figure out where the country's going to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Sir?
Hi. My name is Thomas Reardon, and I'm an information security officer at the NIH. So I deal with information security on a day-to-day basis. One of the things I do relates to contracting arrangements. So I basically have contractors who are providing things for us. One of them is Battelle, by the way. And basically I just make sure that I'm following NIST guidance, making sure that all of the security assessments and authorizations are intact. But I think one of the things I wanted to mention, because I remember back in 2009, there was a testimony before the House Subcommittee on Homeland Security. And I'm sure some of you know who Marianne Davidson is at Oracle. And she advanced this Monroe-like doctrine. And I was pretty impressed by that. I mean, I didn't expect it. What do you think about that? Because a lot of what we're talking about with regard to doctrine, I mean, it really is part of our history. It really is who we are as leaders. It's not who we are as reactionaries. So that's my question.
It's funny, as I was sitting next to the Admiral here, I was just thinking about, you know, it was Mahan and pushing forward the doctrine of sea power for the United States. It's nice to hear, and I know Marianne, so a little bit of biases here. This is really not necessarily a government-based issue, and that is the problem here, big time. This is about business. We have our biases here because, look, we're in the government town here. This is it. We don't produce anything else here. We just, that and hotels are what we do here. In Marriott, we do Hilton, and we do government here. This is an 80 to 85% private issue. It is really among those groups, such as Oracle or Microsoft or the ISPs or whomever else, who are on the front lines of this. And the idea of giving them, again, an overarching guidance to say, look, this is where we think we need to go. And we, the government, can assist you, help you, perhaps even instruct, perhaps sometimes just tell you what it is that you need to do. Because my sympathy here is that they're caught out too. They don't have a doctrine to follow. One of the things that I took away from the action of the last Congress is everybody was beating themselves over what kind of bills to put forward or what kind of bills would be acceptable. And U.S. Chamber came in and said, no, we won't do anything. And people were, the usual kind of blame spreading here. But it said something to me. It said to me that, look, the business community here is confused. They're upset. They think they're about ready to get nailed with some costs about which they have no understanding and may have no limits. So until you have something that overarchingly addresses, here's your responsibility. We're going to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare. Here's your part of it. You as a citizen, for the love of God, get your software updated. Get your, go out there and get your, I dare I say McAfee, get your McAfee done. Where's McAfee? Symantec, whatever else. Where you business, if we're going to require you to do things, we're going to indemnify you. We're going to give you the information to defend yourselves. We're going to overcome a security system that was developed for the Cold War and has gone through twistifications within Homeland Security right now that are eye-watering. And I couldn't agree with her more. We need to do that. And this country has a history of those doctrines. That's quite correct. The Monroe Doctrine carried us for almost 100 years. The idea of involvement overseas carried us since 1945, with containment as the basis for that. And we need that new doctrine. Jamie, you were going to say something.
Yeah, with all due respect to President Monroe, who I deeply respect, I mean, that was the articulation of what our government was going to do with regard to other governments, European governments that might want to be in this hemisphere. Immensely more complex if we're going to say that private interests in cyberspace are now national interests. And there's a hint of that in Presidential Policy Directive number 20 that we've never seen, but it seems to be implicit in that. And that's where we have to start intruding on some things that make us a little bit uncomfortable. So private interests, private industry, front line, what is the government role in that? Is it information? Is it actually going out and doing something for them? Is it creating markets that up the security standard beyond what the market may supply? And I'll give you an example on that. One of the things that Steve Crocker and I have talked about is the secure border gateway protocols. I mean, we have 40,000 systems. If AT&T decides today, if there were the standards and AT&T said, we're going to institute secure border gateway protocols to prevent internet route hijacking, it would cost them a bunch of money and it would do no good. And the reason is because everybody needs to adopt them for it to do much good at all. The United States has an advantage right now if it would like to create an incentive for AT&T and Verizon and L3 and other Tier 1 ISPs to do that because we've kind of got the center of gravity, at least right now. The United States may not always have that. And so that's why we really need to move to a doctrine that gets into those uncomfortable areas and says the proper role for government is creating incentives to up those standards.
Jamie, can I add? I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Being what it is, nobody's going to take that down. Not us, not the hackers, not the other nation states. Because we're all out of business if they do that. I
hope you're right. I think there may be some people that might like to take it down just to see what happens in the United States.
Yeah, and we've had little things like that. We've had our DNS traffic pass through Chinese DNS servers for 15-odd minutes, stuff like that.
Can I just add to something that Admiral Barnett said? I mean, part of that function that government serves there, and I'm a pretty conservative guy. I'd like to keep government out of as many things as possible, but there is a legitimate role for government. Yes. And one of the things it does in doing the things that Admiral Barnett's talking about is it levels the playing field. If everybody has to do something, then you don't have this constant second guessing, well, what if I do it, my competitors don't do it? It says, no, you got to do these things. And, you know, we do define certain things as national interest, maybe not necessarily national security interests, but, you know, we do tell companies that there's occupational safety and hazard regulations, there's environmental regulations, that these are in the interest of the country, and you're going to do these things. So, I mean, I think it's an argument over what we're going to tell people to do, but, I mean, I don't think that there's no precedent whatsoever for the government setting national interest.
Right. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Simpson Garfinkel. I've been writing about cyber since the 80s. And I had a chance to look through the book. And most of this book seems to be about cybersecurity and cyber attack. And the problem is that I think that a lot of the cybersecurity problems really reflect other problems in our nation, like a problem with education and manufacturing policy and immigration policy. So I think that the cyber problems are really symptoms rather than causes. And in reading the book, I found no references to that, just half a paragraph about the educational problem. The second issue that I have here is the book takes the premise that nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy, nuclear doctrine, is a powerful way to discuss cyber. And I think that's fundamentally flawed. I think that the proper analogy is biowarfare and chemical warfare. And here's why. For starters, there's a much lower cost of entry in cyber, as there is in bio, as there is in chem. The only difference between a biowarfare plant and a vaccine plant is whether or not they kill the virus before they put it into the vials. For that reason, a lot of the discussions of bio and chem had to be conducted in secret. We couldn't tell people of the specific chemicals you could get at the local department store that would kill 1,000 people in a subway. And you don't have that problem when discussing nuclear materials. So there's elements of the bio and the chem which are much more illustrative of the current problems we're having in cyber. And this book, because it takes that nuclear strategy, misses that. The other issue is the dual nature. We have this problem about whether cyber is a government responsibility, whether it's an industry responsibility. You said it's probably an act of war to put vulnerabilities in our computer systems, and by that nature, then we should be taking acts of war against Google and Microsoft, because they've put more vulnerabilities in our computers than the Chinese have. But they've even put intentional vulnerabilities in. So the whole nature of the argument is different, I think, than what's outlined here. This looks very, very useful, but it's a very small part of the overall problem. And the problem is we have to engage on those bigger issues first.
I'm the guy who likes to argue, so I'll be the first one to comment about your thoughts about our book. By the way, and I really, absolutely, totally admire people that can go through a book that quickly and help us pick it out. We needed you last year. There is a common belief out there that STEM will fix everything. And if we can educate our population better, lots of these problems will go away. And every time we have a problem brought about by science and technology, it's easy to say, well, if the population was just a little bit smarter, we wouldn't have these problems. And there might be some real truth to that. But the problem of us being vulnerable in cybersecurity is really not a symptom of our STEM problem. It's the technology itself. I'd make the point that if we really educated we had a really well-educated population, science and technology educated population, the internet might be a hell of a lot more dangerous place, because all those out there with nefarious intent would actually know what to do. We're probably a little safe today because there's a lot of bad guys out there who dropped out in 5th grade and can't type out some of their emails. So I think that's an argument that's worth discussing. I go on to your more important point about the book being more modeled on or related an awful lot to a nuclear analogy and the nuclear kind of a environment. Actually, that's not true. We actually talk an awful lot about how the nuclear example, it does not fit, and how this is so much very different than that. And there's a couple comments in at least 2 of the chapters I can think of off the top of my head that agree with you that in fact chem bio and a few other types of models are more appropriate. The references in the book to the nuclear doctrine was references mostly meant to say it's instructive to note that when we had a really bad problem, we didn't get our arms around it until we had a doctrine. Not so much that that was the right doctrine, but that we developed a doctrine, and that if we're going to get it right this time, we need to know that we need a doctrine too. Not the same one we had for the nuclear realm. There's debate about whether that doctrine was successful, but we need a doctrine.
And let me just add something Mike just said, and that is, somewhere in that book, and I couldn't find it fast enough. I'm pretty sure it's in the conference report somewhere. We actually did have the debate at the conference, and we did make the point that in fact bio was a better example of what we're up against than nuclear. However, if you look at the debate that's happening around Washington more times than not in the last 5 years, it has a Cold War nuclear tinge to it, right? Secretary Panetta is out, need the cyber Pearl Harbor, right? And it's because in part it's the American psyche, right? I mean, the American psyche hasn't really had to face a biological event. Scary as heck, and especially for those who are well versed in it, we understand that, and that's why we think it is a little more bio-like than it is nuclear-like. But in fact, large part of Battelle's history and business are experts in chem bio world, so we understand it very well. But I would also argue that in fact we also resonate, even today in the administration, there's more concern about a terrorist group getting hold of nuclear materials to create a radiation-like attack in the United States than there is on bio. It's part of the American psyche, right? And so part of the way we approached this was to address that first, but also emphasize that doesn't do it. One more thing on education. Battelle has a long-standing focus and history on education, especially STEM education. In fact, a good portion of Battelle's revenue goes back into philanthropy, primarily in STEM education. We hold that very dear, and in fact, you're right, the book only addressed a portion of that, but I go to Mike's point, and that is we don't even have the national doctrine that has people so intimately engaged in what the threats are that they're willing to really get into the educational component. Now we're trying. I mean, the head of our cyber unit actually heads the NDIA cyber STEM panel, for example. We have a lot of us who are involved in various aspects. So I don't want to. Yeah, there's not a lot in the book itself, but it clearly is of a high priority for us, especially going forward.
4 p.m. doing a speed round, the next 2
Yeah,
questions.
the speed round real quick.
All right.
Mine's pretty much just a comment, so it'll speed things up a bit. My name is Richard Lowry. I'm a military historian and author, and today I'm here representing syndicatednews.net. I think that after this last couple of hours, we all understand that we need to establish a doctrine. We need to pound a stake in the ground that we can all start working from. But I'm going to leave here today with a sense of urgency and a tinge of futility. As you spoke to Moore's Law, I've lived Moore's Law. I saw my first computer in 1967. So I've seen how technology has stayed ahead of policy for all those years. And you talked about the government and how there's 4, 6, and 8 year cycles in the government, and if you can't get it done in that amount of time, it just doesn't happen. Let me suggest that we try to develop a doctrine, as the military does, where they look 10 and 20 years into the future. And I guess my real question here today is, how can we take a quantum leap forward to catch up with the technology cycle, so what we come up with when we're finished is meaningful in the day it's published and it's not obsolete?
Gosh, I hope that the doctrine is not dependent on the government catching up with the technology cycle, because as Randy said, I don't think we'll ever get there. I do think that we need to have the powerful conversation of getting everybody around the table, so private industry, government experts, the cyber savants, the privacy and civil liberties advocates, all the stakeholders who have a thing, and have that powerful conversation with the attitude that we have not had over the last 2 to 4 years of kind of gridlock, but everybody coming to the table said, we have got to find the most effective way to do this. And the convener for that may be the Battelle concept of getting this ongoing step. It may be someone else, but we've got to do it.
We're going to do very quick questions and very quick answers. You get the opinion with all that we've said today that the book should be about 3 times as thick. Sir.
So I wanted to ask a question about what the thinking might be about response to a doctrine, particularly how we might want to minimize failure in the sense that David Smith was talking about. On the one hand, one of you mentioned that certain countries are trying to push treaties and responding in kind is inadequate. On the other hand, if we demonstrate our resolve in a particularly scary way about what our abilities are in the cyber world, we could prompt the kind of tit for tat that we've been dealing with to some extent with nuclear technology for the last 50 years.
Either one.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm very skeptical of the treaty approach to things. The problem with treaties, as we had throughout the arms control era, is they're great for the countries that intend to abide by them, and they really don't do much for the countries that don't intend to abide by them. And now we have the added issue of you've got subnational groups, various forms of inchoate anarchist groups, terrorist groups, all sorts of things out there. I just don't think treaties are going to work. It's kind of it's a feel-good thing. Everybody comes together, they have a conference, they sign a document, and they say, there, you see, that won't happen, and that's absolute rubbish. As far as prompting reactions, I think that's kind of a popular misnomer. The reality is when the atom was first split in 1939, Hitler started a nuclear program within 3 months. This notion that because the United States did it, all of a sudden everybody's doing it. That's absolutely nonsense. I mean, I'm sorry, but if everybody was lined up to emulate the United States, you'd have human rights everywhere, you'd have free and fair elections, you had investigations of problems, you had women's rights, you'd have all sorts of things going on if everybody was lined up to copy the United States. The reality is that countries develop weapons for good and sufficient reasons of their own. They acquire weapons for geopolitical reasons, for ideological reasons, but not because the other guy did it. And the only thing it seems to me that we're going to do is if the United States deprives itself of certain things, is the United States won't have those things. I think we need to take advantage of technology. We have to do it legally. We have to be in conformance with international law. But the notion that you're going to open a Pandora's box, Pandora was mythical. There's no box.
Last question.
From SciTech Services. We're a computer forensics company. We play the cat and mouse game. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a government advocate who told Joe and Jane Citizen what to do for civil defense. This is what you should be doing. These are the things you should be thinking about. Today, there's advocates saying I should stop smoking, exercise more, eat more vegetables. Who's the advocate telling Joe and Jane Citizen to secure their mobile devices? I counted no less than 12 people checking their email while I was in line. How many of you have your Bluetooth turned on? With a utility here, bad things can happen to Joe and Jane Citizen. What if he's the guy who works at the power plant?
Who's in charge?
That was our prime theme during the discussion. It was our prime theme during our offsite, and as mentioned by the Admiral, it's still a big part of the book, and we hold it up as one of the #1 things that our government, us in the discussion, have to hold our government responsible for resolving, and that is who's in charge, by name, and how are we going to hold them accountable for making sure that that type of thing goes on. So we're very much with you. Final comments?
That's a great final question, by the way.
Yes, it is.
And in fact, if I can make a final comment on that question, one, you're absolutely right. We addressed it in the book, and the real issue there is the president owns the bully pulpit. I mean, the issue of a doctrine, of a national level doctrine, is to get the citizenry not only involved and engaged in the debate, but feeling like they have ownership of the problem, right? I will tell you that General Alexander's out there right now talking about 90-day turn cycles, right? When's as you point out, who's updated their security in the past 90 days and who plans to in 90-day turn cycles?
Probably 90 days is a long time. Isn't
I
it?
personally think that the U.S. Department of Communications and Cyberspace should do something about it.
Okay.
We still have that yet.
With that, I want to give you all a time to get out of here, fight the traffic, and get home and have a nice dinner. I want to thank you all for coming and remind you that our prime theme here was to start and to format a discussion. So please continue to talk about it. Write your neighbors, hold your own forums, get the public involved. And in light of that, I would note that there is another gathering like this tomorrow up on Capitol Hill in the Visitor Center, room 203, at 10 a.m. to continue this, sponsored by Battelle. You're all invited to that one and to the many others that we hope to hold ourselves, and we encourage you to hold. This is the beginning, if you will, of a discussion that hopefully we turn into a movement that hopefully will get our leadership to do something about this problem. And with that, I'd like to once again thank the authors very much for all of their work, including Randy with us here today, and everybody who put so much into this book. It is really a nice book. I'm sure you've got a chance all to feel it and take a look at it. A couple of you have even skimmed through it and read it. I want to recommend that this is, at this time of the year, a really suitable and worthy Christmas present. From 2 to 92, you know, everybody should have a copy of this. And if a copy is not what you want to give your 2-year-old grandchild, you can buy an electronic version on Amazon and put it on your PDA or your device. Thank you all for coming.